And it's Ken Kreitzer for Cam Vets Media. We cover cadets, midshipmen, the military, and veterans proudly since 2008. Always want to recognize our great sponsors, the New York Yankees, and also the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. Now, we have a chance to talk to one of our friends, a former colleague at WVOX, retired lieutenant commander from the U.S. Navy, a surface warfare officer, and now an adjunct instructor at Norwich in Vermont, Norwich University. Great to see you, Brett Morash. Brett, how are you?
I'm doing great, Ken. Thanks for having me.
Good to see you. Now, a lot happening on the defense military front in Ukraine, but also the defense of Israel. Really an outstanding effort by U.S. military in coordination with Israel, and also several allied countries
Mhm.
defending against nearly 300 drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles that were fired at Israel. And the vast majority were knocked down with very little damage reported. Brett, what did it take to defend against a barrage of 300 missiles and drones?
Well, I mean, that's a hugely complex question, Ken, because I mean, it really goes to, as you pointed out before, like this large, complex, integrated air defense system, which Israel has that, and it's also like in the layered way, because it's not just simply, I mean, as you point out, we're talking about the Iranians had fired ballistic missiles, which, they have their own trajectories. They fired cruise missiles, which, if it was like an American style one, they're terrain hugging, very hard to shoot down. And then, relatively low speed drones, but the drones also have very low radar cross section. So you have to be able to find them amongst all the clutter that's out there. So, when you look at what they just pulled off, I mean, first of all, you have to always respect the threat. I mean, the facts of the matter are is the Iranians do have are a highly threatening state. They have all of these weapons at their disposal. They've provided those weapons to groups such as the Houthis or even Hezbollah to conduct their own brand of nefarious acts. Um, but at the end of the day, you have to be able to respect the fact that the Iranians could put that much up in the air at the same time. The whole point of that is to overwhelm the defender. If you look at like U.S. Navy ships, they were designed in the cold, like the Arleigh Burke type class, the Aegis destroyers and cruisers. Those are really designed in the Cold War context to defend against a saturation rate against, let's say, a carrier vessel battle group. But over the intervening sort of 40 years of technology, while we still call those ships Aegis ships, there's been a tremendous number of upgrades that's there in order for them to track further, track more. The capabilities of the defending weapon systems have gotten only better. I think when you look at what just happened here, because you had those kind of basic three classes of weapons being fired, you had to break that up into sort of bins, if you will, where that integrated air defense system was intercepting those weapon systems all the way up until the very end. So you start looking at how that surveillance works. I'm sure that there was an incredible amount of the intelligence apparatus out there that was giving fair warning when something might be coming, which obviously helped. The ability of the defenders, in this case, Israel and the allied nations, they knew roughly where this stuff was coming from, right? It's not like they have to worry about stuff coming from behind necessarily. Maybe some stuff coming from the Red Sea from the Houthis. But at the end of the day, what they'll do is they'll break that whole battle space down into responsibility areas for lower level organizations. So, for example, like if you look at this like as the large operational battle space, if they break that up into smaller areas, you start looking at things like, the very forward part where you had fighter airplanes. And if you follow some websites like FlightAware 24, one of the things that actually did show up that people were able to see was tanker aircraft coming out of Qatar, Kuwait, places like that, that were going up over Iraqi airspace and refueling, air breathing like F-16s, those sorts of things. And while you couldn't see the F-16s on IFF on this like publicly available software, the tankers were up there tanking somebody. And then so a lot of the news reports have been talking about how fighter airplanes were being used to shoot down a lot of the drones and some of the cruise missiles as they're kind of eating up the enemy weapon systems coming in. The ballistic missile defense, I think we talked about this on the phone the other day. That's actually much, much harder to do, because the systems that we have in place are really sort of using a kinetic vehicle to hit a kinetic vehicle, both of them moving at like high Mach numbers, like Mach 20, crossing targets. I mean, the technology that's designed to that. I mean, I used to think of the SM-6 systems, or I'm sorry, SM-3s that we would shoot for ballistic missile defense as like using a spaceship to hit a spaceship.
Yeah.
It's not like the Cold War where, like, I think people who are old enough remember the Nike bases or the Nike missile bases around New York City. Those weapons actually had nuclear weapons on them because you just had to get the nuclear weapon close enough to the incoming missiles to be able to basically create an atmosphere, as the expanding gas bubble, and that would knock the weapon out. So,
Yeah,
but
my father
yeah,
actually
sorry.
worked on that in Baltimore in the mid 1950s. One of his assignments coming back from the tail end of his career, which started during World War II, was working at a Nike missile defense base in Baltimore.
Yeah,
And
probably defending technically DC.
exactly, that's what they said. They were defending the
Yeah.
capital region with that. But I didn't realize that the tactic used previously was to put a small nuclear warhead on the missile and blow it up near where an incoming missile might be. So is that the way the basically the way the system worked at the time?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, they would know, like, because physics are physics, so they would roughly know where the missiles would be coming inbound, and then these interceptors would go up. And if you look at a Nike missile, and one of the reasons they call it the Nike system is it's incredibly fast weapon system. I mean, like, these things were going off the rail, and they were going up into up into space like incredibly fast. And then that nuclear weapon, as it exploded, what would happen is that would throw off, effectively create like almost like a gas bubble, if you can think of it that way. It was like superheated gas, like as the weapon would explode. But what that would do is it would mess up the kinematics of the inbound warhead
I'm sure.
enough that it wouldn't be able to re-enter the atmosphere. Because it's like even like when you look at like the North Koreans, where they're using their missile systems, and some of those systems can now at least reach the west coast of the U.S. The big trick is the reentry vehicle. Like that, getting that right is very, very hard. So in sort of the 1950s, 60s way, they were using weapon systems they were able to use, before some of the treaties that were put in place in order to basically break up these missile attacks. And then, but once these treaties went into place, you weren't able to do that anymore in the same manner. So that's where things like the SM-3 systems, and I think the 6 is the other one, or the upgraded Patriot or THAAD for the Army side, what is it, GBI interceptors for the Air Force. Those are really designed to are kinetically hit the inbound weapon system, whatever it is. There was some furtive attempts at using the airborne ballistic laser, which I think you may have seen. It was sort of very Star Wars weapon. It was like a 747 airframe with a laser mounted on it.
Is that
Um,
actually operational or is it?
yeah, I don't think they actually ever did a really satisfactory test on the actual ABL. Part of the problem when they were working on that initially, and this goes back now almost 30 years, right? Is that the laser system itself was great and it worked and it put a tremendous amount of power out. But the way that worked on an airplane was tough because, I mean, you've been on an airplane, obviously. Airplanes flex, and them trying to keep that airplane flexing in flight, even as little as it would, and keeping the laser to actually shoot out the turret and not, somewhere else on the plane was really, really hard. Like I don't think they were able to really do that effectively. Yeah, we used to joke that like that laser was leaving the airplane one way or the other, either through the turret or it was going to bore its own hole,
Yeah,
because the airplane would flex in flight. That was a huge problem. The other thing is too is that with the airborne ballistic laser, you actually have to be that weapon only works in the boost phase of a ballistic missile. And if you think of it sort of like a, like a soda can, being pushed from below, right? With like the ballistic missile,
yeah,
um, that the laser hitting the side of that weapon heats up the metal and changes the metallurgic properties temporarily, if you will. And so that pressure from the booster causes like it to collapse on that side and it kind of folds
yeah.
like a soda can, if you will. So
Well, yeah, that's amazing technology, but
it's
when
off
it came,
topic for what we're talking about today, but
yeah, no, 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 it's so important because the technology, when it came to a critical moment, worked. Um, I was going to ask you a little bit about the ballistic missile package that the Navy has on its Arleigh Burke destroyers. I think it was 10 years ago, we did a radio segment on that on WVOX, and they explained that the Navy's destroyers carry those, and they can knock down missiles at 17,000 miles an hour, and they would always have one parked off of North Korea. Um, but again, the limitation they told us was that it's 95% effective and there's a chance of not getting through. Is that kind of like one of the issues that you've got to have multiple layers because none
yeah.
of the systems are 100% effective?
Yeah, and it's also it's like a salvo rate thing too. So, one of the things that we used to talk about was if your anti-aircraft missile had, let's say, a 67% probability of kill, then but that also meant there was a 33% chance it was going to get by, right? Like, that's sort of the other piece of it. So you start doing these kind of statistical games where in order to intercept a missile like that, especially if you only have one chance at shooting it, like as far as like, you could shoot, wait, and then if you didn't hit it, you could shoot again. So, these are some of the kind of challenges you're talking about. So, like in essence, you might be firing two interceptors for every inbound weapon system that's up there. I mean, just basic probability math. And I think my memory is correct. If it like a 67% chance that any one missile will or intercept the inbound. If you put two up, that's really only a 95%
Yeah,
chance of success. And I think you even saw that the other day. And again, I don't know how many interceptors they put up. I do not know what the probability kill is or probability intercept or anything like that. But it sounds like three ballistic missiles made it through and hit the air base they were shooting for. I don't think anyone got hurt on the air base. I think some child was killed by debris falling
yeah,
somewhere in the
we
flight
heard,
paths.
sadly.
Yeah, there's collateral damage, but it sounds like what the Iranians were shooting at, which was in this case a military air base, three ballistic missiles, warheads did make it through. But if you're talking about like 100 missiles, being shot, and again, I don't know how many ballistic missiles the Iranians put up, you're still talking about like a high probability of interception. But again, amazing technology, and I thought that the Israeli response, and this is stuff we talk about in our class, the Israeli response was incredibly clever. And I don't know if you want to talk about that now, Ken, or
Yeah,
later.
describe what how the Israelis responded.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, like in my class where I teach strategy and policy, I mean, war is an extension of politics at the end of the day, right? You're trying to force the enemy to do your will because you can't do it in a political way, right? So, the Iranians and I kind of thought of it this way, the Iranians had about three weapons make it through. They hit an air base. The Israeli response, from what I've been able to read in the open media, was that they fired these things called Blue Sparrows, which are um, sort of like an emulator of a Iranian style missile. So like these things were designed that you would shoot them, the Israelis would shoot them um, at their own systems so that they could practice on realistic targets. So these things were effectively practice missiles and they're fired from F-15s, I think is the airplane that can carry them. But like it sounds like they flew three F-15s undetected into probably Jordanian or is Iraqi airspace or both. Fired these three weapons. They've all made it through to where they were going and hit like an air. I think it was not an airbase. There was like a defending air defense site, probably like an S-300, like a SA-20, I think is what the NATO name is. But it's S-300. It's a Soviet era sort of air defense system. But what I thought was really clever with that is that because it was really a practice drone, it didn't have an explosive warhead. They hit
Really?
exactly what they hit exactly what they said they were going to shoot at, or what they wanted to shoot at. The Iranian air defense system, for as capable as it is, did not intercept it at all, even though I know they put a lot of ordnance up, because you saw the videos of that. And, so now it's sort of like the Iranians got three missiles through, not a whole lot happened. The Israelis basically showed their hand saying, like, if we really wanted to do this, it would be extremely painful and you wouldn't be able to shoot down any of our stuff. So I think that was so restrained on behalf of the Israelis. Incredibly clever use of the systems and technology they have available for really high strategic purposes. Just
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. It's amazing. Sadly, the one Israeli young woman was injured in that, they said from collateral damage, and
Yeah.
very sad for the young woman and her family there. But a couple of things that people have noticed. One is the expense of knocking down a drone, which could be relatively inexpensive. But I guess these were designed to fly a fair distance, but they fly very slowly, is my understanding.
Hmm.
But it's still, what's the cost benefit trade-off? I mean, some of the countries, like we'll get to Ukraine in a moment, but drones can be relatively inexpensive. Now, perhaps the ones that Iran sent were larger, more expensive, more sophisticated,
Yeah.
but they still, is it a different weapon system that you use to knock down a drone versus a much faster missile?
So what I've been led to believe is that in a general sense, the drones that were inbound were shot down by like F-16s and planes like that, using either the cannon, like the internal cannon on those fighter planes, or some sort of missile. Again, I mean, the per cost hour of keeping an F-16 up in the air is incredibly high, right? Like, because you're talking about the entire train that keeps it up there, right? Like the Air Force tanker, the gasoline, the cost of maintenance on that bird, right? So yeah, it is expensive, but when nation states, they put their militaries in place for exactly this sort of stuff to defend against this. I mean, I don't think it's hard to kind of Monday morning quarterback and say like, maybe you could have let the drones get through. Like you just can't do that, right? Like
No,
that
no.
at the end of the day. And so people who want to say like this is just a money thing, it's like, yeah, there is a monetary piece of this. Sort of the real question is, when you start talking about like you do only have a limited number of air defense missiles, and that's either like a shipboard standard missile, Patriot batteries, AMRAAMs on like on a fighter aircraft. There are only so many of those in existence in the inventory, right? And they are expensive. I mean, these things are, the low cost ones are measured in, the six figures, right? And even a cannon shell on an F-16, I'm sure that that's probably, up there like $30 a round or something like that, for the bean counters to really kind of nug that out. Um, but I think that they're going to try to use an economy of force where they can. So like that's why using fighter jets to shoot down drones makes a lot of sense. I mean, you saw that in what's going on in the Red Sea, where the fighter planes, the F-18s coming off the carrier, are the ones taking down the preponderance of the Houthi drones, right?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. When I was at the Navy League conference in Washington a couple of weeks ago, the Navy officials speaking were very pleased at how their sailors and Marines had fought off uh, drones launched at the actual U.S. Navy ships as well as commercial
Yeah.
vessels in the Red Sea. Uh, I was curious whether they used, missiles from like the Arleigh Burkes that were there, or whether, as you said, it was airborne.
Probably a combination. Because again, it's what are you defending against, right? Like, and what are the timelines? I mean, if your timeline is like you have like a total of like a minute to a minute and a half to respond to engage something, you're going to probably go to a missile before you're going to say like, okay, let's vector an airplane in there and, get this guy shot down. Like there's going to be this kind of coordinated air defense that's run typically by the cruiser captain, whoever the commanding officer of the cruiser is typically the air defense commander. And they'll organize how that's going to be. My guess is if they were escorting ships, they probably had one of the Arleigh Burkes was probably using a standard missile to shoot the drones down. Just because the probability to kill is much higher. And then standard missile shooting at like a drone, probability kill is probably approaching 100%. Unless the missile has some sort of like in-flight problem, which does happen. And again, there's only so many interceptors out there on these ships anyway. I mean, you're talking about like a cruiser has like about 112 or so holes, but those are all different types of mix of weapons. It could be Tomahawks, it could be anti-aircraft missiles, or it could be a anti-submarine rocket. So, you're going to have this kind of combination of systems. But I haven't seen any data, and I think the Navy's being relatively tight-lipped about exactly what they're using, as you would imagine.
Yeah.
Just because. Because I assure you that the PRC knows a pretty good idea how many interceptors are out there in the world. And if they're able to count the number that we're shooting at any given time, they're able to take that off of the inventory they think we have. So, and we're doing the same thing when we look at like what Russia's doing in Ukraine. Like every time they fire an S-300, or a KH-59 cruise missile, they're able to kind of figure that stuff out.
Well, that's true. Let's switch for a moment to the developments in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Good news from the U.S. Congress that the House passed a aid bill that benefits not just Ukraine but Israel and Taiwan.
Yeah.
About 90 billion. I believe I read about 65. Majority of that's going to Ukraine. Ukrainian officials from the president on down were saying they were in dire need of ammunition, that they were running out. In fact, I heard one report that they were down to 1 round to shoot off for every 10 rounds the Russians could fire back.
Yeah, I believe that.
And in fact, there was a missile attack last week where Russians fired 11 missiles at a target, and the Ukrainians only had ammunition to knock down about half of them. So a number got through, tragically. And so, where do you see the state of the Ukraine war? I did see something in the paper that the Russians are starting to blame themselves for why it's not going well for them.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, like, the standing army that was in place at the beginning of the conflict, the 2022 January Russian army is a fraction of itself. I mean, I've read everything from like 59 to 65% of their standing army has been eaten up, either killed or injured or, however disbanded since the beginning of the conflict. So what that really though equates to is that most of the troops on the front line are relatively new, probably conscripted or cajoled in some way. I mean, probably heard about like the prisoner battalions, things like that, where the Russians are basically making the deal like you get out of prison if you fight in Ukraine, right? I that's still going on. And but the big difference between the Russian army and the Ukrainian army of 2022, as opposed to the army of like 2014 when Russia captured Crimea and the Donbass region, is that in 2014 you had the Ukrainian army, which was still somewhat of a Soviet model army, versus the Russian Soviet model army, which was much, much larger. So when those two things interface with each other, it's just going to be the amount of force on force that you're talking about, right? So the Ukrainians were going to lose that conflict. In 2022, the intervening 8 years had seen primarily, I would say, British kind of model army being developed, where you had non-commissioned officers at a very, very low level able to make decision making. And so they organized much more like our military or NATO style military. Plus, they had a lot of NATO quality weapons to defend themselves, which is why you saw when the war broke out in 2022, the Ukrainians blunted the forward movement of the Russians. Down near Kherson, they pushed them all the way back across the river into the onto the other bank. But what you're seeing right now is like you pointed out, like they're running out of ammunition. So if the Russians are willing to still do these sort of like frontal assaults, like we're talking about like Leningrad or something like that, the Ukrainians don't have enough weapons to shoot or enough bullets to shoot all these guys. Like, I mean, it's like that's the type of warfare. You're talking about like World War I level
Mm.
trench warfare ongoing on our planet right now across the entire battle space of Ukraine. The Russians, at least since December, have made a lot of pretty solid tactical gains, especially in the eastern side over in the Donbass region. Advika got lost not too long ago. You've seen a couple of other major towns that are starting to fall. And then of course the ground right now is starting to thaw. So what you're going to see at the beginning of the spring with the rains, it's going to slow down the warfare because like it's going to be like mud basically fighting. And what you'll see is as we approach the summer months, that battlefield is going to start to dry up, so it'll pick up the tempo. So the timing on the Ukrainians getting all these weapons and artillery in particular, the ATACMS missiles, or rockets rather, the ATACMS rockets, that right now is absolutely the critical time because the faster they can get that, the more they can be prepared for the eventual Russian assaults. And I think just like this time kind of last year where the Ukrainians had started to receive modern main battle tanks, Western style ones like the Leopard 2s and the M1 Abrams, hopefully we'll be able to see them exploit some of that, those technologies to kind of push the Russians further back. Although because of the number of mines that have now since been laid,
Mm.
that's really what would bedevil the Ukrainians last year. So plus the
Yeah.
drones, I mean, that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, and it's going to be a tragedy there because it'll take many years after the war is complete to remove all the mines that have been
Oh,
placed there.
oh
And
my, yeah, millions of mines. I mean, like,
uh, it's just an awful legacy of this of an awful conflict. Uh, One very positive note when we were down in Washington at the Navy League was the representatives of the Swedish Navy were there,
hmm
and the I believe she was a rear admiral was introduced and recognized. Got a standing ovation from the nearly 1,000 people at the lunch with Secretary of the Navy Del Toro introducing her to be Sweden joining NATO. And what a positive thing that is. That NATO, the value of NATO is increasing, and it seems to be unifying.
yeah. No, and I think that, I mean, if you're watching like, Sweden, which is very similar to Switzerland, like an armed neutrality. In that case, like since I think the 1600s, they like 1688, they've been a neutral nation. Now throwing their hat on the ring on the side of NATO, which, I mean, NATO is there really to slow Russia down, right? I mean, like that's pretty unambiguous. And then for Finland, which, as throughout the Cold War was very much part of the I would say the Soviet sphere, although a capitalist nation, definitely had leanings, for various reasons toward the Soviet Union, for them to throw their hat in the ring with NATO, even more amazing. So, I mean, I think that, Europe is really starting to wake up. I mean, I think this is stuff that, was talked about in, previous years where, our NATO partners were not willing to provide for their own defense, at least in the same sort of percentages like the US was. I think that some of the conflicts, like the war in Libya, I forgot what the operation was called at this point, but the war in Libya, like while it was a very much a European face on it, those airplanes were flying up there because U.S. tankers and U.S. logistics support were keeping them pushed forward. So I think you're starting to see the NATO nations really realize, like, if Ukraine falls, what's next, or is there a next?
Yeah,
So I
yeah,
certainly think our European partners are on board. And I think, last year when on WVOX, um, Dennis and Tawny asked me one morning, when I was on the show, like, what I think about supporting, Ukraine, and I think that this is, some of the kind of politics and that are going on right now, supporting Ukraine, not supporting Ukraine. I told him, I said, look, I grew up in the Cold War as a kid, so like in my head, it's very hard for me not to think of Russia as the enemy. I just do. Um, I said, but if you are a person who believes that a weakened Russia that is unable to threaten its neighbors is a good thing, then supporting the Ukraine efforts is a good thing. And I think that that should be either side of the aisle. If that's your metric of should we support them or not.
yeah, yeah. No, it used to be up until recently that Russia was a country you could do business with. And
Yeah,
there was good relations for business, for culturally, even certainly on the space program. U.S. depended on Russia to transport astronauts to the space shuttle for a period of
yeah.
time, and there was generally a working relationship. But all that has gone away under Vladimir Putin. Hey, one quick question for you. The other side of the world, a lot of discussion at the Navy League conference of and representation from Australia because of the New Deal to build nuclear submarines in
Yeah.
Australia based on U.S. designs and
Mhm.
UK designs. And also, I read an article about Australia being a backup source of production of ammunition, where the United States doesn't have enough capacity, and Australia might become a place that would produce more ammunition. But it seemed like another there. It's not NATO, but it seemed like in the Pacific, again, the United States is got a very strong coordination of its
Mhm.
military with its allies.
Yeah, I mean, look, I at the end of the day, we have a very special relationship with the Australians in particular. I mean, that goes back, at least to the Second World War. And while the our relationship with New Zealand is kind of taken a little bit of a back seat over the years, I think our relationship with Australia has only grown stronger. And you're seeing that. I mean, like sharing nuclear technology and design of nuclear powered submarines is like a huge step forward. And I don't know if you saw that in the article, but like they had previously actually made a deal with France to build French style submarines. Although they were
Yeah,
going to be like
yeah.
diesel electric. That fell apart because, I think at the end of the day, the 800-pound gorilla is the PRC, right? And the PRC is absolutely creating a blue water navy. Full range of capabilities, aircraft carriers, submarines. They have an incredibly huge ability to enlist their maritime fleet as somewhat naval auxiliaries, and I mean that like their fishing fleet in particular.
Mm.
So and they're playing a home, I mean for the Chinese, they're playing a home game. Everything the US does is at the end of a very, very long logistics line. And we're able to do that. And we have our allies like the Australians, and I would even say like the Japanese that are extremely strong allies of ours. But that only goes so far. So it's interesting. And I think that again, that relationship is only getting stronger with Australia. I didn't hear about the ammunition thing, but that doesn't surprise me either.
Yeah, it
Because
came out a couple of weeks ago that the Australians might become a site for defense ammunition production.
yeah.
That the U.S. has is amazingly limited capacity.
Yeah, I think that they're even more hawkish against PRC than we are sometimes. I mean, like if you listen to their rhetoric, I mean, but it's also it's a much closer problem to them. Where their northeast, I'm sorry, their northwest, kind of section of the country is, right there where the Chinese are having a tremendous amount of influence, and influence in countries that previously were, I would say like aligned along with, kind of Australia in the West, really interesting. But, the Chinese, you have to give them credit. I mean, they do an amazing job of, combining all of the powers, the diplomatic, information, military, and economic powers of lever that nation states enjoy. And, I think they have less constraints than we do, in a lot of ways. I'll give you an example. Like when I was working in East Africa on the task force at GTFOA, there were things that we couldn't do that the Chinese military could just do. Because we had things like oh my gosh, I forgot the Leahy vetting, that kind of came out of the School of the Americas. You probably remember that, like back in the 80s.
What
School of the
was that
Americas,
about?
what's that?
What was that about?
The School of the Americas, like when Ollie North was involved. It was like when they were basically, they had this school for like these senior military officers,
Yeah.
and then they would go back to their dictatorships and oppress their people, and it kind of blew up. Well, some of the kind of downside of those sorts of things is that they put a rule in place that you have to vet all of these people that come through your training course, which makes a lot of sense, right? Like you wouldn't want some guy who has war crime record, to come to a U.S. schoolhouse, right? But the Chinese don't have to worry about that because they don't have a law that prevents it. So they can train whoever they want. But it might be the guy that we want to train. Like, and so, you kind of get hamstrung by rules and things like that. Or the Chinese, would go in a good example is they just built like a multi-lane highway from Dar es Salaam up to Arusha, which is in Tanzania. And, all paid for by big Chinese money. The locals get a good deal, but what they did was they gave away their oil drilling rights in Lake Victoria to the Chinese, So, the Chinese are coming there. I think they're a little, I think they're very clear about what they want. And, the Chinese have a very long history, so their plans are very long. They have a lot of stability. They have a one-party state, as you know, in the Communist Party. Their plan is their plan and they stick to it and they don't have to worry about change of administrations and, kind of the populist view because they keep their people, under a gun barrel too. So it's very hard, like this is all very serious stuff. Um, and, like I said, in my class, I teach at Norwich Strategy and Policy. This is the stuff we talk about all the time. So.
Well, that must be a terrific class to be in. Lieutenant Commander retired from the U.S. Navy, Brent Morash. Great to hear your insight on what's happening and reflect on some of the things that we heard at the Navy League of the United States meeting in Washington this past month. And I hope that you'll join us again very soon.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks again, Ken.
Brett Morash, thanks so much. This is Ken Kreitzer for CAM Vets Media. We cover cadets, midshipmen, the military, and veterans proudly since 2008. We always want to thank and recognize our sponsors, the New York Yankees. They're off to a good start in the year, and the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, taking care of families of fallen special operations members. So we'll be doing this again. Thank you for watching today.